bent over the table. "Do not forget to curtsy like a good girl on your way out." Nynaeve made it as far as the foot of the steps before pounding her fist on her thigh in a fury. How dare the woman! Did she think that she could just... Did she think that Nynaeve would put up with... "I thought she could do anything she wanted to you," a small voice whispered in her head. "I said she could kill me," she snarled at it, "not humiliate me." Before much longer, everybody would be threatening her with that bloody Shanshan woman. The wagon stood abandoned except for a few rough-coated horse handlers for guards near the tall, sprawling canvas fence erected to contain Luca's show. From this large brown grass meadow 1/2 a mile from Samara, the gray stone walls of the city were clearly visible, with squat towers at the gates, and a few of the taller buildings showing roofs of thatch or tile. Outside the walls, villages of huts and rude shanties sprouted like mushrooms in every direction, full of the prophet's followers, and they had stripped every tree for miles, either for building or for firewood. The show's entrance for patrons was on the other side, but 2 of the horse handlers with stout cudgels stood on this side to discourage any who did not want to pay from entering as the performers did. Nynaeve was almost upon them, striding as hard as she could and muttering angrily to herself, when their idiotic grins made her realize that the shawl was still looped over her elbows. Her stare wiped their faces blank. Only then did she cover herself properly, and slowly. She was not about to have these louts think they could make her yelp and leap. The skinny one with a nose that took up half of his face held the canvas flap aside, and she ducked through into pandemonium. Everywhere people thronged in noisy milling clusters of men and women and children, in chattering streams flowing from one attraction to the next. All but the Stradit performed on raised wooden stages Luca had built. Sarandon's boar horses had the largest crowd, the huge gray animals balancing on their foreheads, even the baby. Long snouts curved up sinuously, while Clarine's dogs had the smallest, for all they did backsprings and flips over each other's backs. A good many people paused to stare at the lions and the hairy boar-like kapars in their cages, the strangely horned deer from Arafel and Saldeia and Aradoman, and the bright birds from the light Newware, and some waddling brown-furred creatures with big eyes and round ears that sat placidly eating leaves from branches gripped in their forepaws. Luca's tale on where they came from varied. She supposed he did not know, and he had not been able to make up a name for them that pleased him. A huge snake from the marshes of Ilion, 4 times as long as a man, earned nearly as many gasps as the Stradit, although simply lying there apparently asleep. But she was pleased to see that Latel's bears, at the moment standing atop huge red wooden balls that they rolled in circles with their feet, attracted few more than the dogs. Bears these people could see in their own forests, even if these did have white faces. Latel sparkled in the afternoon sunlight in her black spangles. Sarandon glittered almost as much in blue, and Clarine in green, though neither had quite as many sequins sewn on as Latel, but every last one of the dresses had a collar right up to the chin. Of course, Petra and the Chavanas were performing attired only in bright blue breeches, but that was to show off their muscles. Only understandable. The acrobats were standing one atop the other's shoulders 4 high. Not far from them, the strong man took a long bar with a large iron ball at each end. 2 men were needed to hand the thing up to him, and immediately began twirling it in his thick hands, even spinning the bar around his neck and across his back. Tom was juggling fire and eating it as well. 8 flaming batons made a perfect circle. Then suddenly he had 4 in each hand, 1 sticking up from each cluster. Deftly popping each upraised flaming end into his mouth in turn, he appeared to swallow and took them out extinguished, looking as if he had just had something tasty. Nynaeve could not fathom how he did not scorch his mustaches off, much less burn his throat. A twist of his wrists, and the unlit batons folded into the lit like fans. A moment later, they were making two interlinked circles above his head. He wore the same brown coat he always did, though Luca had given him a red one sewn with sequins. From the way Tom's bushy eyebrows rose as she stalked past, he did not understand why she glared at him. His own coat, indeed! She hurried on toward the thick, impatiently buzzing crowd circled around the two tall poles with the rope stretched tightly between. She had to use her elbows to reach the front row, though two women did glare and snatch their men out of her way when the shawl slipped. She would have glared back had she not been so busy blushing and covering herself. Luca was there, frowning as anxiously as a husband outside a birthing room, next to a thick fellow who had his head shaved except for a grizzled topknot. She slipped in on the other side of Luca. The shaven-headed man had a villainous look. A long scar sliced down his left cheek, and a patch over that eye was painted with a scowling red replacement. Few of the men she had seen here were armed with more than a belt knife, but he wore a sword strapped to his back, the long hilt rising above his right shoulder. He looked vaguely familiar for some reason, but her mind was all on the high rope. Luca frowned at the shawl, smiled at her, and tried to put an arm around her waist. While he was still trying to catch his breath from her elbow and she was still getting her shawl decently back in place, Jewelin came staggering out of the crowd on the other side, conical red hat tilted jauntily, coat half off one shoulder, and a wooden mug in his fist, slopping over the rim. With the over-careful steps of a man whose head contains more wine than brains, he approached the rope ladder leading up to one of the high platforms and stared at it. "Go on," someone shouted. "Break your fool neck." "Wait, friend," Luca called, starting forward with smiles and flourishes of his cloak. "That is no place for a man with a belly full of—" Setting the mug on the ground, Jewelin scampered up the ladder and stood swaying on the platform. Nynaeve held her breath. The man had a head for heights, and well he should after a life of chasing thieves across the rooftops of Tyr, but still. Jewelin turned as if lost. He appeared too drunk to see or remember the ladder, his eyes fixed on the rope. Tentatively, he put one foot onto the narrow span, then drew it back. Pushing the hat back to scratch his head, he studied the taut rope, and abruptly brightened visibly. Slowly he got down on hands and knees and crawled wobbling out onto the rope. Luca shouted for him to come down, and the crowd roared with laughter. Halfway across, Jewelin stopped, swaying awkwardly, and peered back, his eyes latching onto the mug he had left on the ground. Plainly he was considering how to get back to it. Slowly, with exceeding care, he stood, facing the way he had come, and wavering from side to side. A gasp rose from the crowd as his foot slipped and he fell, somehow catching himself with one hand and a knee hooked around the rope. Luca caught the Tarabonner hat as it fell, shouting to everyone that the man was mad, and whatever happened was no responsibility of his. Nynaeve pressed both hands tight against her middle. She could imagine being up there, and even that was enough to make her feel ill. The man was a fool, a pure bull-goose fool. With an obvious effort, Jewelin managed to catch the rope with his other hand and pulled himself along it hand over hand to the far platform. Swaying from side to side, he brushed his coat, tried to pull it straight, and succeeded only in changing which shoulder hung down, and spotted his mug at the floor of the other pole. Pointing to it gleefully, he stepped out onto the rope again. This time at least half the onlookers shouted for him to go back, shouted that there was a ladder behind him. The others only laughed uproariously, no doubt waiting for him to break his neck. He walked across smoothly, slid down the rope ladder with his hands and feet on the outside, and snatched up the wooden mug to take a deep drink. Not until Luca clapped the red hat on Jewelin's head and they both bowed, Luca flourishing his cloak in such a way that Jewelin was behind it half the time, did the watchers realize that it had all been part of the show. A moment of silence, and then they exploded with applause and cheers and laughter. Nynaeve had half thought they might turn ugly after being duped. The fellow with the topknot looked villainous even while laughing. Leaving Julian standing beside the ladder, Luca came back to stand between Nynaeve and the man with the topknot. I thought that would go well. He sounded incredibly self-satisfied, and he made little bows to the crowd as if he had been the one up on the rope. Giving him a sour frown, she had no time to speak the acid comment on her tongue, because Elaine came bounding through the crowd to stand beside Julian, with her arms upraised and one knee bent. Nynaeve's mouth tightened, and she shifted her shawl irritably. Whatever she thought of the red dress that she had found herself wearing without really knowing how, she was not sure that Elaine's costume was not worse. The daughter heir of Andor was all in snow white, with a scattering of white sequins sparkling on her short coat and snug breeches. Nynaeve had not really believed that Elaine would actually appear in the clothes in public, but she had been too concerned over her own attire to give her opinion. The coat and breeches made her think of men. She had never approved of men wearing boys' clothes, but the color and spangles made these even more flagrant. Julian held the rope ladder for Elaine to climb, though there was no need. She went up as adeptly as he could have. He vanished into the crowd as soon as she reached the top, where she posed again, beaming at the thunderous applause as if at the adulation of her subjects. As she stepped out onto the rope, somehow it seemed even thinner than when Julian had been on it, Nynaeve all but ceased breathing, and she stopped thinking of Elaine's clothes or her own at all. Elaine made her way out onto the rope, arms outstretched to either side, and she was not channeling a platform of air. Slowly she stepped her way across, one foot in front of the other, never wavering, supported only by the rope. Channeling would be far too dangerous if Mogadeen had even a clue to where they were. The Forsaken or Black Sisters could be in Samara, and they would be able to feel the weave. And if they were not in Samara now, they might be soon. On the far platform, Elaine paused to considerably more applause than Julian had received. Nynaeve could not understand that, and started back. Almost to the end, she pivoted smoothly, walked back halfway, pivoted again, and wobbled, just catching herself. Nynaeve felt as though a hand had her by the throat. At a slow, steady pace, Elaine high-walked to the platform, once more posing to thunderous shouts and clapping. Nynaeve swallowed her heart and breathed again, raggedly, but she knew it was not over. Raising her hands above her head, Elaine suddenly cartwheeled herself along the rope, black tresses whipping, white-sheathed legs flashing in the sun. Nynaeve yelped and clutched Luca's arm as the girl reached the far platform, stumbled in landing, and caught herself just short of going over the edge. "What's the matter?" he murmured beneath the gasp rising from the crowd. "You've seen her do this every evening since Sienda, and a good many other places too, I would think." "Of course," she said weakly. Eyes fixed on Elaine, she barely noticed the arm he slipped around her shoulders, certainly not enough to do anything about it. She had tried to talk the girl into feigning a sprained ankle, but Elaine insisted that after all of that practice with the power, she did not need it now. Maybe Julian did not. Apparently he did not. But Elaine had never gone scrambling over rooftops in the night. The return cartwheels went perfectly, and the landing, but Nynaeve did not look away or loose her hold on Luca's sleeve. After what now seemed the inevitable pause for applause, Elaine returned to the rope for more pivots, one leg raised and whipping down and up so quickly that it seemed she kept it outstretched the whole while, and for a slow handstand that lifted her straight as a dagger, white-slippered toes pointed to the sky, and a backflip that had the crowd gasping and her swaying from side to side, only just catching her balance. Tom Marilyn had taught her that, and the handstand. From the corner of her eye, Nynaeve caught Tom 2 places down from her, eyes riveted to Elaine, poised on the balls of his feet. He looked as proud as a peacock. He looked ready to rush forward and catch her if she fell. If she did fall, it would be at least partly his fault. He should never have taught her those things. One last passage of cartwheels, white legs flashing and glittering in the sun faster than before. a passage that had never been mentioned to Nynaeve. She would have eviscerated Luca with her tongue had he not muttered angrily that Elaine adding to the act just for applause was a good way to break her neck. One last pause to pose for more of that applause, and Elaine at last climbed down. Shouting, the crowd rushed in on her. Luca and 4 horse handlers with cudgels appeared around her as if by the power, but even so, Tom beat them to her, limp and all. Nynaeve jumped as high as she could, just managing to see over enough heads to make out Elaine. The girl did not seem frightened or even taken aback by all the waving hands trying to touch her, stretching between her encircling guards. Head high, face flushed from effort, she still managed a cool and regal grace as she was escorted away. How she could do that, garbed as she was, Nynaeve simply could not imagine. "Face like a bloody queen," the one-eyed man muttered to himself. He had not gone running with the others, but merely let them stream past. Roughly dressed in a plain coat of dark gray wool, he certainly looked solid enough to have no fears of being knocked down and trampled. He appeared as if he could use that sword. Burn me for a sheep-gutted farmer, but she's flaming well brave enough for a bloody queen. Nynaeve gaped at him as he strode away through the crowd, and it was not his language, or rather it was, partly. Now she remembered where she had seen him, a one-eyed man with a topknot who could not say 2 sentences without the vilest curses. Forgetting about Elaine, she was certainly safe enough. Nynaeve began pushing her way through the throng after him. Chapter 38. An Old Acquaintance. With the crowds, it took Nynaeve some little time to catch up, muttering every time she was jostled by a man gaping at everything in sight, or a woman dragging a child with either hand, children usually trying to drag her to 2 different attractions at once. The one-eyed man barely paused to look at anything except the big snake and the lions, until he reached the boar horses. He had to have seen them earlier, situated as they were near the patron's entrance. Every time the Sredit stood on their hind legs, as they were doing now, the great tusked heads of the adults could be seen by those outside the canvas fence, and the press to enter intensified a little more. Beneath a wide red sign that said Velan Luca in ornate gold script on both sides, 2 of the horse handlers collected admission from people funneled between 2 thick ropes, taking the money in clear blown-glass pitchers, both thick and flawed. Luca would never lay out coin for better, so they could see that the coins were right without touching them. They dumped the money straight from the pitchers through a hole in the top of an iron-strapped box so wrapped about with chain that Petra had to have put it in place before the first silver penny went in. Another pair of horse handlers, thick-shouldered, broken-nosed men with the sunken knuckles of brawlers, stood nearby with cudgels to make sure that the crowd remained orderly. And to keep an eye on the men taking the money, Nynaeve suspected. Luca was not a trusting man, especially when it came to coin. In fact, he was as tight as the skin on an apple. She had never met anyone so stingy. Slowly she elbowed close to the man with the gray-streaked topknot. He had had no trouble reaching the front rank before the Sredit, of course. His scar and painted eye patch would have seen to that, even without the sword on his back. At the moment he was watching the big gray animals with a grin and what she supposed was wonder on that stony face. Uno? She thought that was the right name. His head turned to stare at her. Once she had the shawl back in place, he raised the stare to her face, but no recognition lit in his dark eye. The other, the painted red glaring one, made her a little queasy. Sarandon waved her goad, shouting something slurred beyond intelligibility, and the Sredit turned, Sanit the cow placing her feet on Mare's broad, rounded back, while he remained upright. Neren the calf put her feet low on Sanit's back. "I saw you in Faldara," Nynaeve said, "and again on Tomon Head, briefly, after Falma. You were with—" She did not know how much she could say with people cheek by jowl around her. Rumors of the Dragon Reborn had circulated all through Amadisia, and some even had his name right. With Rand. Uno's real eye narrowed. She tried not to see the other. And after a moment he nodded. I remember the face. I never forget a flaming pretty face. But the hair was bloody well different. Nina? Nynaeve, she told him sharply. He shook his head, eyeing her up and down, and before she could say another word, he had seized her arm and was all but dragging her through the entrance. The horse handlers there recognized her, of course, and the broken-nosed fellows started forward, hefting their cudgels. She waved them away furiously, even as she was yanking her arm free. It took 3 tries, and still it was more a matter of his letting go. The man had a grip like iron. The men with the clubs hesitated, then drifted back to their places when they saw Uno drop his grip. Apparently they knew what Valen Luca would prefer them to be guarding. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded. But Uno only motioned her to follow, watching to see that she did so without more than slowing his stride through the crowd waiting to get in. He had slightly bowed legs, and moved like a man more used to the back of a horse than his own feet. Growling to herself, she picked up her skirts and stalked after him toward the town. 2 other menageries were set up behind brown canvas walls not far off, and beyond them more lay scattered among the crowded shanty villages. None too close to the city walls, though. Apparently the governor, as they called the woman Nynaeve could have named mayor, though she had never heard of a woman mayor, had decreed half a mile as the distance, to protect the town in case any of the animals got loose. The sign over the entrance to the nearest show said Marin Gome in florid green and gold. 2 women were clearly visible above the sign, clinging to a rope hanging from a tall framework of poles that had not been there when Luca's walls went up. Apparently the boar horses rearing high enough to be seen was having an effect. The women contorted themselves into positions that made Nynaeve think uncomfortably of what Mogadin had done, and somehow even managed to hold themselves out in horizontal handstands to either side of the rope. The crowd waiting impatiently in front of Mistress Gome's sign was almost as large as the one in front of Luca's. None of the other shows had anything visible that she could see, and their crowds were much smaller. Uno refused to answer her questions or say a word or do more than give her dire frowns until they were out of the jam of people and onto a cart path of hard-packed dirt. "What I am flaming trying to do," he growled then, "is to take you where we can flaming well talk without you being torn to flaming bits by flaming folk trying to kiss your flaming hem when they find out you flaming know the Lord Dragon." There was no one within 30 paces of them, but he still stared around for anyone who might hear. "Blood and bloody ashes, woman! Don't you know what these flaming goat-heads are like? Half of them think the Creator talks to him over bloody supper every night, and the other half think he is the bloody Creator." "I will thank you to moderate your language, Master Uno, and I will thank you to slow down, too. We are not running a foot race. Where are you going, and why should I stir another step with you?" He rolled his eye toward her, chuckling wryly. "Oh, I do remember you. The one with the mouth. Regan thought you could skin and butcher a bull at 10 paces with your tongue. Jaina and Nangu thought 50. At least he did shorten his stride. Nynaeve stopped dead. Where and why? Into the town. He did not stop. He strode right on, flipping a hand for her to follow. "I don't know what you're doing here, but I remember you were mixed up with that blue woman." Snarling under her breath, she gathered her skirts and hurried after him again. It was the only way to hear. He continued as if she had been beside him the whole time. "This is no place for you to be. I can scrape together enough enough coin to get you to Tyr, I think. Rumor says that's where the Lord Dragon is." Again, he looked around warily. "Unless you want to go to the island instead." He must have meant Tar Valon. There's odd rumors floating around about that, too. Peace, if there aren't." He came from a land that had not known peace in 3,000 years. Shinarans used the word as talisman and oath both. "They say the old Amerlin's been deposed, executed maybe. Some say they fought and burned the whole..." He paused, taking a deep breath and grimacing horribly. The whole city. Walking along, she studied him in amazement. She had not seen him in nearly a year, had never spoken more than 2 words together to him, and yet he... Why did men always think a woman needed a man to look after her? Men could not lace up their own shirts without a woman to help. We are doing quite well as we are, thank you. Unless you know when a river trader will dock on his way down river. We? Is the blue woman with you, or the brown? That had to be Moiraine and Varen. He was certainly being cautious. No. Do you remember Elaine? He gave a blunt nod, and a mischievous impulse seized her. Nothing seemed to faze the man, and he obviously expected to just take charge of her welfare. You saw her again just now. You said she had a... She made her voice gruff in imitation of his. Face like a bloody queen. He stumbled in a satisfactory way, and glared around him so fiercely that even 2 white cloaks riding by skirted wide around him, though they tried to pretend he had nothing to do with it, of course. Her? He growled incredulously. But her bloody hair was black as a raven's. He glanced at hers, and the next minute he was pacing up the cart path again, muttering half to himself. The flaming woman is daughter to a queen, a bloody queen, showing her bloody legs that way. Nynaeve nodded in agreement, until he said, You bloody Southlanders are bloody strange. No flaming decency at all. He had fine room to talk. Shienarans might dress properly, but she still blushed to remember that in Shienar, men and women bathed together as often as not, and thought no more of it than of eating together. Did your mother never teach you to talk decently, man? His real eye frowned at her almost as darkly as the painted one, and he rolled his shoulders. In Faldara, he and everyone else had treated her as nobly born, or the next thing, too. Of course, it was hard to pass herself off as a lady in that dress, and with her hair a shade that nature never made. She arranged her shawl more snugly and folded her arms to hold it in place. The gray wool was terribly uncomfortable in that dry heat, and she herself was not feeling very dry at all. She had never heard of anyone who died sweating, but she thought she might well be the first. What are you doing here, Uno? He looked around before answering. Not that he had need. There was little traffic on the path, an occasional ox-drawn cart, a few folk in farm clothes or rougher, here and there a man on a horse, and no one seemed willing to come any closer to him than they had to. He appeared a man who might cut somebody's throat on a whim. The blue woman gave us a name in Johanna, and said we were to wait there until she sent instructions. But the woman in Johanna was dead and buried when we arrived. An old woman, died in her sleep, and none of her relatives had ever heard the blue woman's name. Then Masema started talking to people, and, well, there was no point staying there for orders we'd never hear if they did come. We stayed close to Masema because he slips us enough to live on, though none except Bartu and Nengar listened to his trash. The grizzled top-knot swung as he shook his head in irritation. Suddenly, Nynaeve realized that there had not been a single obscene word in that. He looked about to swallow his tongue. Perhaps if you cursed only occasionally, she sighed. Maybe once every other sentence. The man smiled at her so gratefully that she wanted to throw up her hands in exasperation. How is it that Masema has money when the rest of you do not? She remembered Masema, a dark, sour man who liked no one and nothing. Why, he's the bloody prophet they've all come to hear. Would you like to meet him? He gave the impression of counting his sentences. Nynaeve breathed deeply. The man was going to take her literally. He might find you a flaming boat if you want one. In Gildan, what the prophet wants, the prophet usually gets. No, he always flaming gets it in the end, one way or another. The man was a good soldier, but who'd have ever thought he would turn out like this? His frown took in all the rude villages and the people, even the shows and the city ahead. Nynaeve hesitated. The dreaded prophet, rousing mobs and riots, was Masema, but he did preach the coming of the Dragon Reborn. They were almost to the town gate, and there was time yet before she must stand up and let Brigitta shoot arrows at her. Luca had been more than disappointed that the woman insisted on being called Marion. If Massima could find a boat heading downriver, today maybe. On the other hand, there were the riots. If rumor inflated them tenfold, then only hundreds had died in towns and cities farther north. Only hundreds. Just don't remind him that you have anything to do with that bloody island, Uno went on, eyeing her thoughtfully. Now that she thought of it, she realized that he very likely did not know what her connection to Tarvalin actually was. Women did go there without becoming Aes Sedai, after all, to seek help or answers. He was aware that she was involved in some way, but no more than that. He isn't much friendlier to women from there than the White Cloaks are. If you just keep your mouth bloody well shut about it, he'll likely pass it over. For somebody who comes from the same village as the Lord Dragon, Massima will probably have a flaming boat built. The crowds were thicker at the city gates, flanked by squat gray towers, men and women streaming in and out, afoot and mounted, in every sort of garb from rags to embroidered silk coats and dresses. The gates themselves, thick and iron-bound, stood open under the guard of a dozen spearmen in scaled tunics and round steel caps with flat rims. Actually, the guards paid more attention to half their number of white cloaks lounging nearby than to anything else. It was the men in snowy cloaks and burnished mail who watched the flow of people. "Do the White Cloaks cause much trouble?" she asked quietly. Uno pursed his lips as if to spit, glanced at her, and did not. Where do they bloody not? There was a woman with one of these traveling shows who did tricks, sleight of hand. 4 days ago, a flaming mob of pigeon-gutted sheepheads tore the show apart. Valen Luca had certainly never mentioned that. Peace. What they wanted with the woman. Claimed she was... He glowered at the folk hurrying by.
Hey, Bastian, how you doing? You know what? Let's put this bowl down. Let's do a dab.
Broke her bloody neck getting her to a rope, so I hear. But they hung her corpse anyway.
How you been doing,
Massima had the
Bastian?
ringleaders beheaded, but it was White Cloaks whipped up the bloody mob. His scowl
This is
matched
a
the red
dab.
eye
It's a
painted
mix
on his
between
couch. There's been too many flaming
ice cream
hangings and beheadings, if
cake,
you bloody
sugar
well ask me.
wax,
Bloody Massima's as bad as the bloody
lemon
White Cloaks
pound
when it
cake
comes to
crumble.
finding a dark friend under every flaming rock. Once every other sentence, she murmured, and the man actually blushed. Don't know what I'm thinking, he grumped, coming to a stop. Can't take you in there. It's half festival and half riot, with a cut purse every third step and a woman not safe out of doors after dark. He sounded more scandalized about the last than the rest. In Shinar, a woman was safe anywhere, anytime, except from Trollocs.
Oh, it's all good, bro.
And any man would die to see it so.
As long as you're all right and safe.
I'll take you
That's
back.
all that matters.
When I find a way, I'll come for you. That settled it for her. Pulling her arm loose before he could get a grip on it, she quickened her pace toward the gates. Come along, Uno, and do not dawdle. If you dawdle, I will
We
leave
did
you
it live
behind.
yesterday.
He caught up to her, grumbling under his breath about the stubbornness of women. Once she understood that that was his subject, and that apparently he did not think her injunction against cursing held when talking to himself, she stopped listening. Chapter 39. Encounters in Samara. The White Cloaks at the gates gave Uno and Nynaeve no more mind than they gave anyone else in the steady throng, which was to say a cold, suspicious stare, searching yet quick. Too many people made anything else impossible, and the scale-armored guards did too. Not that there was any reason for more, except in her mind. Her great serpent ring and Lan's heavy gold ring nestled in her pouch.
My iPad is too.
Neckline meant she could not wear them on the thong.
That mine has a little keyboard on it too.
Children of the Light to pick out a tower-trained woman by instinct. Her relief was palpable when those icy, unfeeling eyes swept past her.
Because
the soldiers paid the two of them as little attention once she rearranged her shawl yet again. Uno's scowl might have helped send their eyes back to the White Cloaks, but the man had no right to scowl in the first place. It was her business. Rewrapping the folded length of gray wool one more time, she tied the ends around her waist. The shawl defined her bosom more than she wished, and still exposed a bit of cleavage, yet it was a considerable improvement on the dress alone. At least she would not have to worry about the shawl slipping again.
I don't mind, well, we had to pay extra for it,
but... The weather really should be turning soon. They were not that far south.
But mine's pretty old one. Mine's like
patiently waited on her for a
2-3 years old, if not older.
Whether this was simple courtesy.
It's the old ass
His
one.
Scarred face looked a deal too patient. But finally they walked together into Samara.
Cause my keyboard's like a whole case.
A babble of noise hung over everything, no one sound distinguishable. People jammed the rough stone-paved streets all but shoulder to shoulder, from slate-roofed taverns to thatch-roofed stables, from raucous inns with simple painted signs like the Blue Bull or the Dancing Goose, to shops where the signs had no words, only a knife and scissors here, a bolt of cloth there, a goldsmith's scales or a barber's razor, a pot or a lamp or a boot. Nynaeve saw faces as pale as that of any Andorman, and as dark as that of any of the sea folk, some clean, some dirty, and coats with high collars, low collars, no collars, drably colored and bright, plain and embroidered, shabby and near new made, in styles strange as often as familiar. One fellow with a dark forked beard wore silver stones across the chest of his plain blue coat, and two with their hair in green, men, over each ear below their shoulders, had tiny brass bells sewn to their red coat sleeves, and the turned-down tops of thigh-high boots. Whatever land they hailed from, those two were not
definitely make a good video.
Their dark eyes were hard and searching as Uno's, and they carried curved swords.
Pignons are good too. Definitely stay safe, because I know how that is out in the area where pignons are.
And hands intricately tattooed, had to be one of the sea folk, though he wore neither earrings nor nose ring. The women were equally as diverse, hair ranging from raven black to yellow so pale it was nearly white, braided or gathered or hanging loose, cut short to the shoulders to the waist, dresses in worn wool or neat shimmering silk, collars brushing chins with lace or embroidery, and necklines every bit as low as the one she hid. She even saw a copper-complexioned Damani woman in a barely opaque red gown that covered her
water.
And
you gotta watch out for the cats that's out there.
She wondered how safe that woman would be after dark, or in this broad daylight for that matter. The occasional white cloaks and soldiers in that milling mass seemed overwhelmed, struggling to make ground as hard as anyone else. Ox carts and horse-drawn wagons inched along the haphazardly crisscrossing streets. Bearers jostled sedan chairs through the crowds.
That's the last stab I could take before I got to charge it.
4 or 6 made its laborious way, liveried footmen and steel-capped guards vainly trying to clear a path. Musicians with flute or zither or bittern played at every corner, where there was not a juggler or an acrobat. Their skills certainly nothing to make Tom or the Chavanas worry, always with another man or woman holding out a cap for coins. Ragged beggars drove through it all, plucking at sleeves and proffering grimy hands, and hawkers bustled with trays of everything.
But I would definitely make a good video.
To pears, their cries lost in the din. Her head spun by the time Uno drew her into a narrower street where the throng seemed thinner, if only by comparison. She paused to straighten her clothes, disarrayed from plunging through the crowd, before following him. It was a trifle quieter here, too. No street entertainers and fewer hawkers and beggars. Beggars kept clear of Uno, even after he tossed a few coppers to a wary pack of urchins, for which she did not blame them. The man just did not look charitable. The town's buildings loomed over these narrow ways, despite being only 2 or 3 stories, putting the streets themselves in shadow. But there was good light in the sky, hours yet till dusk. Still plenty of time to get back to the show, if she had to. With luck, they could all be boarding a riverboat by sunset. She gave a start when another Shinaran suddenly joined them, sword on his back and head shaven but for that topknot, a dark-haired man only a few years older than she. Uno gave curt introductions and explanation without slowing. "Peace favor you, Nynaeve," Rhaegon said, the skin of his dark cheek dimpling around a triangular white scar. Even smiling, his face was hard. She had never met a soft Shinaran. Soft men did not survive along the Blight, nor soft
I guess I can't complain too much.
I remember you.
Hasn't been too
Your hair
bad.
was different, was it not? No matter. Never fear. We will see you safely to Masima and to wherever you would go after. Just be sure not to mention Tarvalon to him." No one was sparing them a second glance, but he lowered his voice anyway. "Masima thinks the tower will try to control the Lord Dragon." Nynaeve shook her head. Another fool man who was going to take care of her. At least he did not try to engage her in conversation. The mood she was in, she would have given him the rough side of her tongue if he so much as commented on the heat. Her own face felt a trifle damp, and no wonder, having to wear a shawl in this weather. Abruptly, she remembered what the one-eyed man had said concerning Rhaegon's opinion of her tongue. She did not think she more than glanced at him, but Rhaegon moved to the other side of Uno as if for shelter, and eyed her warily. Men. The streets grew still narrower, and though the stone buildings lining them did not grow smaller, it was more often than not the backs of the buildings they saw, and rough gray walls that could hide only small yards. Eventually they turned down an alley barely wide enough for all three of them abreast. At the far end, a lacquered and gilded coach stood surrounded by scale-armored men. More immediately, halfway between her and the coach, fellows lounged thickly along both sides of the alley. In a motley of coats, most clutched clubs or spears or swords as different as their garb. They could have been a pack of street toughs, but neither of the Shinarans slowed, so she did not either. "The street out front will be full of bloody fools hoping to catch a glimpse of Masima at a bloody window." Uno's voice was pitched for her ears alone. "The only way to get in is by the back." He fell silent as they came close enough for the waiting man to hear. Two of those were soldiers with rimmed steel helmets and scaled tunics, swords at hip and spears in hand, but it was the others who studied the three newcomers and fingered their weapons. They had disturbing eyes, too intent, almost feverish. For once she would have been pleased to see an honest leer. These men did not care whether she was a woman or a horse. Without a word, Uno and Rhaegon unfastened the scabbarded blades from their backs and handed them and their daggers to a plump-faced man who might have been a shopkeeper once, from the look of his blue woolen coat and breeches. The clothing had been good. It was clean, but heavily worn and wrinkled as if it had been slept in for a month. Plainly he recognized the Shinarans, and though he frowned at her for a moment, especially at her belt knife, he silently nodded to a narrow wooden gate in the stone wall. That was perhaps the most off-putting fact of all. None of them made a sound. On the other side of the wall was a small yard where weeds stuck up between cobblestones. The tall stone house, three broad, pale gray stories, with wide windows and scroll-worked eaves and gables, roofed in dark red tiles, must have been one of the finest in Samara. Once the gate was closed behind them, Rhaegon spoke softly. "There have been attempts to kill the Prophet." It took Nynaeve a moment to realize that he was explaining why their weapons had been taken. "But you were his friends," she protested. "You all followed Rand to Falma together." She was not about to start calling him the Lord Dragon. "That's why we're bloody let in at all," Uno said dryly. "I told you we don't see everything the way the Prophet does." The slight pause and the quick half-glance back at the gate to see if anyone was listening spoke volumes. It had been Masima before, and Uno was clearly a man who did
Give me
not
1 second, everyone. I'll be right back.
"Just watch what you say for once," Rhaegon told her, "and likely you will get the help you want." She nodded, as agreeably as anyone could wish. She knew sense when she heard it, even if he had no right to offer it, and he and Uno exchanged doubtful glances. She was going to stuff these two into a sack with Tom and Julian and switch anything that stuck up. Fine house as it may be, the kitchen was dusty, and empty except for one bony gray-haired woman, her drab gray dress and white apron the only clean things in sight as they walked through. Sucking her teeth, the old woman hardly glanced up from stirring a small kettle of soup over a tiny blaze in one of the wide stone fireplaces. 2 battered pots hung on hooks, where 20 could have, and a cracked pottery bowl on a blue lacquered tray stood on the broad table. Beyond the kitchen, moderately fine hangings decorated the walls. Nynaeve had developed something of an eye in the last year, and these scenes of feasts and hunts for deer and bear and boar were only good, not excellent. Chairs and tables and chests lined the halls, dark lacquer streaked with red, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Hangings and furniture alike were also dusty, and the red and white tiled floor had had only a half-hearted lick with a broom. Cobwebs decorated the corners and cornices of the high plaster ceiling. There were no other servants or anyone else in sight until they came to a weedy fellow sitting on the floor beside an open door, his grimy red silk coat much too large for him, and at odds with a filthy shirt and worn woolen breeches. One of his cracked boots had a large hole in the sole, a toe poked through another in the other one. He held up a hand, whispering,
"There we go.
"A light shine on you, and praise the name of the Lord Dragon." He made it sound a question, querulously twisting a narrow face as unwashed as his shirt. But then he did the same with everything. "The prophet can't be disturbed now? He's busy? You'll have to wait a bit?" Uno nodded patiently, and Rhaegan leaned against the wall. They had been through this before. Nynaeve did not know what she had expected of the prophet, not even now that she was aware who he was, but certainly not filth. That soup had smelled like cabbage and potatoes, hardly the fare for a man who had an entire city dancing for him, and only 2 servants, both of whom could well have come from the rudest huts outside the city. The skinny guard, if such he was, he had no weapon, perhaps he was not trusted either, seemed to have no objection when she moved to where she could see through the doorway. The man and woman inside could not have been more different. Masema had shaved even his topknot, and his coat was plain brown wool, heavily wrinkled but clean, although his knee-high boots were scuffed. Deep-set eyes turned his permanently sour look to a scowl, and a scar made a pale triangle on his dark cheek, a near mirror image of Rhaegan's, only more faded with age and a hair nearer the eye. The woman, in elegantly gold-embroidered blue silk, was short of her middle years and quite lovely, despite a nose perhaps too long for beauty. A simple blue net cap gathered dark hair spilling almost to her waist, but she wore a broad necklace of gold and fire drops with a matching bracelet, and gemmed rings decorated nearly every finger. Where Masema seemed poised to rush at something, teeth bared, she bore herself with stately reserve and grace. "So many follow wherever you go," she was saying, "that order flies over the wall when you arrive. People are not safe in themselves or their property. The Lord has broken all bonds of law, all bonds made by mortal men and women." Masema's voice was heated, but intense, not angry. "The prophecies say that the Lord Dragon will break all chains that bind, and it is so. The Lord Dragon's radiance will protect us against the shadow." "It is not the shadow that threatens here, but cut-purses and slip-fingers and head-crackers. Some who follow you, many, believe that they can take what they wish from whoever has it without payment or leave. There is justice in the hereafter, when we are born again. Concern with things of this world is useless. But very well. If you wish earthly justice," his lip curled contemptuously, "let it be this. Henceforth, a man who steals will have his right hand cut off. A man who interferes with a woman or insults her honor or commits murder will be hung. A woman who steals or commits murder will be flogged. If any accuses and finds 12 who will agree, it will be done. Let it be so." "As you say, of course," the woman murmured. Aloof elegance remained on her face, but she sounded shaken. Nynaeve did not know how Gildanin law ran, but she did not think it could be so casual as that. The woman took a deep breath. "There is still the matter of food. It becomes difficult to feed so many. Every man, woman, and child who has come to the Lord Dragon must have a full belly. It must be. Where gold can be found, food can be found, and there is too much gold in the world, too much concern with gold." Masema's head swung angrily, not angry with her, but in general. He looked to be searching for those who concerned themselves with gold so he could unleash fury on their heads. "The Lord Dragon has been reborn. The shadow hangs over the world, and only the Lord Dragon can save us. Only belief in the Lord Dragon, submission and obedience to the word of the Lord Dragon. All else is useless, even where it is not blasphemy." "Blessed be the name of the Lord Dragon in the light." It had the sound of a rote reply. "It is no longer simply a matter of gold, my Lord Prophet. Finding and transporting food insufficient." "I am not a lord," he broke in again, and now he was angry. He leaned toward the woman, spittle on his lips, and though her face did not change, her hands twitched as if they wanted to clutch her dress. "There is no lord but the Lord Dragon in whom the light dwells, and I am but one humble voice of the Lord Dragon. Remember that. High or low, blasphemers earn the scourge." "Forgive me," the begemmed woman murmured, spreading her skirts in a curtsy fit for a queen's court. "It is as you say, of course. There is no lord save the Lord Dragon, and I am but a humble follower of the Lord Dragon, blessed be the name of the Lord Dragon, who comes to hear the wisdom and guidance of the prophet." Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, Massima was suddenly cold. "You wear too much gold. Do not let earthly possessions seduce you. Gold is dross. The Lord Dragon is all." Immediately she began plucking rings from her fingers, and before the second was off, the weedy fellow scurried to her side, pulling a pouch from his coat pocket and holding it for her to drop them in. The bracelet and necklace followed as well. Nynaeve looked at Uno and raised an eyebrow. "Every penny goes to the poor," he told her in a low voice that barely reached her ear. "Or somebody who needs it. If some merchant hadn't bloody given him her house, he'd be in a bloody stable, or one of those huts outside the city. Even his food comes as a gift," Rhaegan said just as quietly. "They used to bring him dishes fit for a king, until they learned he just gave away everything but a little bread and soup or stew. He hardly drinks wine now." Nynaeve shook her head. She supposed it was one way to find money for the poor. Simply rob anyone who was not poor. Of course, that would just make everyone poor in the end, but it might work for a time. She wondered if Uno and Rhaegan knew the whole of it. People who claimed they were collecting money to help others often had a way of letting a good bit stick in their own pockets, or else they liked the power that spreading it about gave them, liked it far too much. She had better feeling for the man who freely gave 1 copper from his own purse than for the fellow who wrested a gold crown from someone else's, and less for fools who abandoned their farms and shops to follow this prophet, with no idea of where their next meal would come from. Inside the room, the woman curtsied to Massima even more deeply than before, spreading her skirts wide and bowing her head. "Until I once again have the honor of the prophet's words and counsel, the name of the Lord Dragon be blessed in the light." Massima waved her away absently, already half forgotten. He had seen them in the hall, and was looking at them with as close to pleasure as his dour face could come. It was not very close. The woman swept out, not even appearing to see Nynaeve or the 2 men. Nynaeve sniffed as the weedy fellow in the red coat waved anxiously for them to come in. For someone who had just given up her jewelry on demand, that woman managed a fine, queenly air. The skinny man scampered back to his place by the door as the other 3 men shook hands in the Borderlands fashion, gripping forearms. "Peace favor your sword," Uno said, followed by Rhaegan. "Peace favor the Lord Dragon," was the reply. "Light illuminate her." Nynaeve's breath. There was no doubt of his meaning. The Lord Dragon was the source of the light, and he had the nerve to speak of blasphemy from others. "Have you come to the light at last?" "We walk in the light," Rhaegan said carefully, "as always." Uno kept silent, his face blank. Weary patience made an odd play on Massima's sour features. "There is no way to the light save through the Lord Dragon. You will see the way and the truth in the end, for you have seen the Lord Dragon, and only those whose souls are swallowed in the shadow can see and not believe. You are not such. You will believe." In spite of the heat and the wool shawl, goosebumps crawled along Nynaeve's arms. Total conviction filled the man's voice. and this close she could see a glint in his nearly black eyes that bordered on madness. He swept those eyes over her, and she stiffened her knees. He made the most rabid white cloak she had ever seen appear mild. Those fellows in the alley were only a pale imitation of their master. You, woman, are you ready to come to the light of the Lord Dragon, abandoning sin and flesh? I walk in the light as best I can. She was irritated to find herself speaking as carefully as Regan. Sin? Who did he think he was? You are too concerned with the flesh. Massima's gaze was withering as it swept over her red dress and the shawl wrapped tightly around her. And what do you mean by that? Uno's eye widened in startlement, and Regan made small shushing motions, yet she could as soon have flown as stopped. Do you think you have a right to tell me how to dress? Before she quite realized what she was doing, she had untied the shawl and looped it over her elbows. It really was much too hot anyway. No man has that right, for me or any other woman. If I chose to go naked, it would be none of your concern. Massima contemplated her bosom for a moment. Not so much as a hint of admiration lit his deep eyes, only acid contempt, then raised that stare to her face. Uno's real eye and painted made a perfect match, scowling at nothing, and Regan winced, surely muttering to himself inside his head. Nynaeve swallowed hard. So much for guarding her tongue. For perhaps the first time in her life she truly regretted speaking her mind without thinking first. If this man could order men's hands cut off, order men hung, with only a jack-fooled excuse of a trial, what was he not capable of? She thought she was angry enough to channel. But if she did, if Mogadine or any Black Sisters were in Samara, but if I don't? She wanted very much to wrap the shawl back around her up to her chin, but not with him staring at her. Something in the back of her mind shouted at her not to be a complete woolhead. Only men let pride overcome sense. But she met Massima's gaze defiantly, even if she did have to stop herself from swallowing again. His lip curled. Such garments are worn to entice men, and for no other reason. She could not understand how his voice could be so fervent and so icy at the same time. Thoughts of the flesh distract the mind from the Lord Dragon and the light. I have considered banning dresses that distract men's eyes and minds. Let women who would waste time in attracting men, and men who would attract women, be scourged, until they know that only in perfect contemplation of the Lord Dragon and the light can joy be found. He was not really looking at her any longer. That dark, burning stare looked through her, to something distant. Let taverns and places that sell strong drink, and all places that would take the minds of people from that perfect contemplation, be closed and burned to the ground. I frequented such places in my days of sin, but now I heartily regret, as all should regret their transgressions. There is only the Lord Dragon and the light. All else is illusion, a snare set by the shadow. This is Nynaeve Almira, Uno said quickly into the first pause for breath. From Emond's Field in the 2 rivers whence the Lord Dragon comes. Massima's head turned slowly to the one-eyed man, and she hastily took the opportunity to redo the shawl as she had had it. She was at Faldara with the Lord Dragon, and at Falma. The Lord Dragon rescued her at Falma. The Lord Dragon cares for her as for a mother. Another time she would have given him a few choice words and maybe a well-boxed ear. Rand had not rescued her. Or not exactly, anyway, and she was only a handful of years older than he. A mother, indeed. Massima turned back to her. The zealous light that had burned in his eyes before was nothing to what was there now. They almost glowed. Nynaeve. Yes. His voice quickened. Yes, I remember your name and your face. Blessed are you among women, Nynaeve Almira, none more so save the Lord Dragon herself. For you watched the Lord Dragon grow. You attended the Lord Dragon as a child. He seized her arms, hard fingers biting in painfully, but he seemed unaware of it. You will speak to the crowds of the Lord Dragon's boyhood, of his first words of wisdom, of the miracles that accompanied him. The light has sent you here to serve the Lord Dragon. She was not exactly sure what to say. There had never been any miracles around Rand that she had seen. She had heard of things in Tyr, but you could hardly call what a Taviran caused miracles. Not really. Even what had occurred at Falma had a rational explanation. Sort of. And as for words of wisdom, the first she had heard out of him had been a fervent promise never to throw a rock at anyone again, offered after she had paddled his young backside for it. She did not believe she had heard another word since that she could call wise. In any case, if Rand had given sage advice from his cradle, if there had been comets by night and apparitions in the sky by day, she still would not have stayed with this madman. "I must travel downriver," she said guardedly, "to join him, the Lord Dragon." That name curdled on her tongue so soon after her promise to herself, but Rand was apparently never anything as simple as he around the prophet. "I am just being sensible. That's all it is. A man is an oak, a woman a willow," the saying ran. The oak fought the wind and was broken, while the willow bent when it must and survived. That did not mean she had to like bending. The Lord Dragon, is in Tyr. The Lord Dragon has summoned me there. Tyr. Massima took his hands away, and she surreptitiously rubbed her arms. She did not have to try hiding it, though. He was staring at something beyond sight again. "Yes, I have heard." Speaking to something beyond sight, too, or to himself. "When Amadisia has come to the Lord Dragon, as Gildan has, I will lead the people to Tyr, to bask in the radiance of the Lord Dragon. I will send disciples to spread the word of the Lord Dragon throughout Tarabon and Aradoman, to Saldeia and Kandor and the borderlands, to Andor, and I will lead the people to kneel at the Lord Dragon's feet." A wise plan, O prophet of the Lord Dragon. A fool plan, if she had ever heard one. That was not to say it would not work. Fool plans often did, for some reason, when men made them. Rand might even enjoy having all those people kneel to him, if he was half as arrogant as Egwene claimed. But I cannot wait. I have been summoned, and when the Lord Dragon summons, mere mortals must obey. Someday she was going to get a chance to box Rand's heads for her need to do this. "I have to find a boat going downriver." Massima stared at her for so long that she began to grow nervous. Sweat trickled down her back and between her breasts, and it was only partly the heat. That stare would have made Mogadeen sweat. Finally he nodded, fiery zealotry fading to leave only his usual dour scowl. "Yes," he sighed. "If you have been summoned, you must go. Go with the light and in the light. Dress more appropriately. Those who have been close to the Lord Dragon must be virtuous above all others, and meditate on the Lord Dragon and his light." "A riverboat?" Nynaeve insisted. "You must know whenever a boat reaches Samara or any village along the river. If you could just tell me where I might find one, it would make my journey much swifter." She'd been going to say easier, but she did not think ease mattered much to Massima. "I do not concern myself with such things," he said testily. "But you are right. When the Lord Dragon commands, you must come on the hour. I will ask. If a vessel can be found, someone will tell me of it eventually." His eyes shifted to the other two men. "You must see that she is safe until then. If she persists in clothing herself in this manner, she will attract men with vile thoughts. She must be protected like a wayward child until she is reunited with the Lord Dragon." Nynaeve bit her tongue. A willow, not an oak, when a willow was needed. She managed to mask her irritation behind a smile that had to carry all the gratitude the idiot man could wish. A dangerous idiot, however. She had to remember that. Uno and Rhaegon made their goodbyes quickly, with more forearm clasping, and hustled her out, one on either arm, as if they thought it necessary to hurry her away from Massima for some reason. Massima appeared to have forgotten them before they reached the door. He was already frowning at the weedy man, waiting next to a bluff fellow in a farmer's coat, who was crumpling his cap in thick hands, awe painted across his broad face. She did not say a word as they retraced their steps through the kitchen, where the gray-haired woman was sucking her teeth and stirring the soup as if she had not moved in the interval. Nynaeve held her tongue while they retrieved their weapons, held it until they were out of the alleyway, into something approaching the width of a street. Then she rounded on them, shaking her finger under each nose alternately. "How dare you drag me out like that?" People passing by grinned, men ruefully, women appreciatively, though none could have had an idea what she was berating them over. "Another 5 minutes and I would have had him finding a boat today. If you ever lay hands on me again—" Uno snorted so loudly that she cut off with a start. "Another 5 bloody minutes and Massima would have bloody well laid hands on you. Or rather, he'd have said that someone should, and then someone flaming well would have. When he says something should be done, there are always 50 flaming hands or 100 or a flaming 1,000 if need be to do it." He stalked off down the street, Rhaegon at his side, and she had to go with them or be left. Uno paced on as if he knew she would trail after. She almost went the other way just to prove him wrong. Following had nothing to do with fear of getting lost in that rabbit warren of streets. She could have found her way out, eventually. He had a flaming lord of the Crown High Council flogged for half the heat in his voice that you had, the one-eyed man growled. Contempt for the word of the Lord Dragon, he called it. Peace. Demanding what bloody right he had to comment on your flaming clothes. For a few minutes you did well enough, but I saw your face there at the end. You were ready to flaming lace into him again. The only thing worse you could have done would be to bloody name the Lord Dragon. He calls that blasphemy. As well name the flaming Dark One. Rhaegon's top-knot bobbed as he nodded. Remember the Lady Baelome, Uno? Right after the first rumors came from Tyr naming the Lord Dragon, Nynaeve. She said something about this Randall Thor in Massima's hearing, and he called for an axe and a chopping block without pause for breath. He had someone beheaded for that? She said incredulously. No, Uno muttered in disgust, but only because she bloody well groveled when she realized he flaming meant it. She was dragged out and hung up by her flaming wrists from the back of her own coach, then strapped the bloody length of whatever village it was we were in then. Her own flaming retainers stood like a bunch of sheep-gutted farmers and watched it. When it was done, Rhaegon added, she thanked Massima for his mercy, the same as Lord Aleshin did. His tone had too much pointedness to suit her. He was delivering a moral and intended her to take it in. They had reason, Nynaeve. Theirs would not have been the first heads he has put on a stake. Yours could have been the latest, and ours with it if we'd tried to give aid. Massima plays no favorites. She drew breath. How could Massima have all this power? And not only among his own followers, apparently. But then there was no reason lords or ladies could not be as great fools as any farmer. A good many were greater in her estimation. That idiot woman with her rings had surely been a lady. No merchant ever wore fire drops. Yet surely Gildan had laws and courts and judges. Where was the queen or the king? She could not remember which Gildan had. No one in the Two Rivers had ever had much truck with kings or queens, yet that was what they were for, them and lords and ladies, seeing justice fairly done. But whatever Massima did was no concern of hers. She had more important problems than worrying over a flock of imbeciles who let a madman trample them. Still, curiosity made her say, does he mean that about trying to stop men and women looking at one another? What does he think will happen if there are no marriages, no children? Will he stop people farming next, or weaving, or making shoes, so they can think about Randall Thor? She enunciated the name deliberately. These two went around calling him the Lord Dragon at the drop of a pin almost as much as Massima did. I will tell you this. If he tries telling women how to dress, he will start a riot. Against him. Samara must have something like a women's circle. Most places did, even if they called it something else, even when it was not a formal arrangement at all. There were some things men just did not have the sense to see to. And they surely could and did call women down for wearing inappropriate clothes. But that was not the same as a man putting his finger into it. Women did not meddle in men's affairs. Well, no more than was necessary, and men should not meddle in women's. And I expect the men will react no better if he tries closing taverns and the like. I never knew a man yet who wouldn't cry himself to sleep if he could not put his nose in a mug now and then. Maybe he will, Reagan said, and maybe he won't. Sometimes he orders things, and sometimes he forgets, or puts it off anyway because something more important comes along. You would be surprised, he added dryly, at what his followers will accept from him without a whimper. He and Una were flanking her, she realized, and watching the other folk in the street warily. Even to her, the pair of them appeared ready to draw swords in a heartbeat. If they actually thought to carry out Massima's instructions, they had another think coming. He isn't against bloody marriage, Uno growled, staring so hard at the peddler with meat pies on a tray that the man turned and ran without taking the coins from two women holding pies in their hands. You're lucky he did not remember you have no husband, or he might have sent you to the Lord Dragon with one. Sometimes he picks out 300 or 400 unmarried men and as many women, and flaming well marries them. Most have never seen each other before that day. If the pigeon-gutted dirt grubbers don't bloody complain about that, do you think they'll open their flaming mouths about ale? Reagan muttered something under his breath, but she caught enough to narrow her eyes. Some man doesn't know how bloody lucky he is. That was what he had said. He did not even notice her glare. He was too busy scanning the street, watching against someone who might try to abscond with her like a pig in a sack. She was half tempted to take off the shawl and throw it away. He did not seem to hear her sniff either. Men could be insufferably blind and deaf when they wished to. At least he didn't try to steal my jewelry, she said. Who was that fool woman who gave him hers? She could not have much sense if she had become one of Massima's followers. That, Uno said, was Aleandra, Blessed of the Light, Queen of bloody Gildan, and a dozen more titles the way you Southlanders like to pile them up. Nynaeve stubbed her toe on a cobblestone and almost fell. So that is how he does it, she exclaimed, shaking off their helping hands. If the Queen is fool enough to listen to him, no wonder he can do whatever he wants. Not a fool, Uno said sharply, flashing a frown at her before returning to watching the street. A wise woman. When you bloody find yourself straddling a wild horse, you bloody well ride it the way it's bloody going if you're smart enough to pour water out of a bloody boot. You think she's smart because Massima took her rings? She's flaming smart enough to know he might demand more if she stopped wearing jewelry when she comes to him. The first time he went to her, been the other way round since, and he did take the rings right off her flaming fingers. She had strands of pearls in her hair, and he broke the strings pulling them out. All of her ladies-in-waiting were down on their knees gathering the bloody things off the floor. Aleandra even picked up a few herself. That doesn't sound so wise to me, she said stoutly. It sounds like cowardice. Whose knees were shaking because he looked at her? A voice in her head asked. Who was sweating herself silly? At least she had managed to face up to him. I did. Bending like a willow isn't the same as cowering like a mouse. Is she the Queen or isn't she? The two men exchanged those irritating looks, and Reagan said quietly, You don't understand, Nynaeve. Aleandra is the fourth to sit on the light-blessed throne since we came to Gildan, and that's barely half a year. Johannin wore the crown when Massima began attracting a few crowds, but he thought Massima a harmless madman, and did nothing even when the crowds grew and his nobles told him he had to put an end to it. Johannin died in a hunting accident. Hunting accident, Uno interjected, sneering. A hawker who happened to be looking at him dropped his tray of pins and needles. Not unless he didn't know one bloody end of a flaming boar spear from the other. Flaming Southlanders and their flaming game of houses. And Elizel succeeded, Reagan took up. She had the army dispersing the crowds until finally there was a pitched battle and it was the army that was chased off. Bloody poor excuse for soldiers, Uno muttered. She was going to have to speak to him about his language again. Reagan nodded agreement but went on with what he had been saying. They say Elizel took poison after that. But however she died, she was replaced by Teresia, who lasted a full 10 days after her coronation, just until she had a chance to send 2,000 soldiers against 10,000 folk who had gathered to hear Massima outside Johanna. After her soldiers were routed, she abdicated to marry a rich merchant. Nynaeve stared at him incredulously, and Uno snorted. That is what they say, the younger man maintained. Of course, in this land, marrying a commoner means giving up any claim to the throne forever, and whatever Baron Goraid feels about having a pretty young wife with royal blood, I hear he was dragged from his bed by a score of Aleandra's retainers, and hauled to Jeddah Palace for a wedding in the small hours of the morning. Teresia went off to live on her husband's new country estate, while Aleandra was being crowned all before sunrise, and the new queen summoned Massima to the palace to tell him he would not be troubled again. Inside 2 weeks, she was calling on him. I do not know whether she really believes what he preaches, but I know she took the throne of a land on the edge of civil war, with white cloaks ready to move in, and she stopped it the only way she could. That is a wise queen, and a man could be proud to serve her, even if she is a Southlander. Nynaeve opened her mouth and forgot what she was going to say when Uno said in a casual tone, "There's a flaming white cloak following us. Don't look around, woman. You have more bloody sense than that." Her neck stiffened with the effort of keeping her eyes forward. Prickles crawled up her back. "Take the next turn, Uno. That carries us away from the main streets and the flaming gates. We can flaming lose him in the crowds." "Take it." She inhaled slowly, made her voice less shrill. "I need a sight of him." Uno glowered so fiercely that people stepped out of their way for 10 paces ahead, but they turned down the next narrow street. She shifted her head a trifle as they made the turn, just enough to peek from the edge of her eye before the corner of a small stone tavern cut off her view. The snowy cloak with the flaring sun stood out among the thin crowd. There was no mistaking that beautiful face, the face she had been sure she would see. No other white cloak than Galad could have a reason to follow her, and none to follow Uno or Regan. Chapter 40. The Wheel Weaves. As soon as the building hid Galad, Nynaeve's eyes darted down the street ahead. Fury bubbled up, at herself as much as Galadadrid Damadred. You witless woolhead. It was a narrow way like all the rest, paved with rounded stones, lined with gray shops and houses and taverns, populated with a scattered afternoon crowd. If you hadn't come into town, he'd never have found you. Too scattered to hide anyone. You had to go see the prophet. You had to go believing the prophet would whisk you away before Mogadin gets here. When are you going to learn you can't depend on anyone but yourself? In an instant, she made her choice. When Galad turned that corner and did not see them, he would begin looking into shops, and maybe taverns as well.
Take this hit. Give me 1 second, everyone.
Gathering her skirts, she darted into the nearest alley and pressed her back against the wall.
Excuse me.
No one glanced at her twice, furtive as she was, and what that had to say about the way things were in Samara she did not want to consider. Uno and Regan were beside her before she finished setting her feet, crowding her farther down the dusty dirt alleyway, past an old splintered bucket and a rain barrel dried to the point of collapse inside its hoops. At least they were doing what she wanted, in a manner of speaking. Tense hands on long sword hilts rising above their shoulders, they were ready to protect her whether she desired it or not. Let them, you fool. Do you think you can protect yourself? She was certainly angry enough. Galad, of all people. She should never have left the menagerie. A fool whim, and one that might ruin everything. She could no more channel here than against Massima. Just the possibility that Mogadin or Black Sisters were in Samara made her dependent on 2 men for her safety. It was enough to screw her anger tight. She could have chewed a hole in the stone wall behind her. She knew why Aes Sedai had warders, all but Reds anyway. In her head, she did. In her heart, it just made her want to snarl. Galad appeared, threading his way slowly through the folk out in the street, eyes searching. By all reason, he should have gone on by. He should have. Yet almost immediately his gaze settled on the alleyway. on them. He did not even have the grace to appear pleased or surprised. Uno and Regan moved together as Galad turned toward the alley. The one-eyed man had his sword out in the blink of an eye, and Regan was scarcely slower for all he paused to push her deeper into the narrow passage. They positioned themselves one behind the other. Should Galad make it past Uno, he would still have Regan to face. Nynaeve ground her teeth. She could make all these swords unnecessary, useless. She could sense the true source like a light unseen over her shoulder waiting for her embrace. She could do it, if she dared. Galad stopped at the alley mouth, cloak thrown back, one hand resting nonchalantly on his sword hilt, a picture of spring steel grace. Except for his burnished mail, he could have been at a ball. "I do not want to kill either of you, Shinaran," he said calmly to Uno. Nynaeve had heard Elaine and Gawain speak of Galad's sword skill, but for the first time she realized that he might really be as good as they said. At least he thought he was. 2 seasoned soldiers with blades bare, and he eyed them as a wolfhound would eye a pair of lesser dogs, not seeking a fight, yet utterly confident he could take both. Never quite looking away from the 2 men, he addressed her. "Someone else might have run into a shop or an inn, but you never do what is expected. Will you let me speak with you? There is no need to make me kill these men." None of the passers-by were stopping, but even with 3 men blocking her view, she could see heads swiveling for a glimpse of what had drawn the white cloak, and plainly taking in the swords. Rumors would be hatching in all those minds and taking flight on wings that made dusk swallows seem slow. "Let him by," she commanded. When Uno and Regan did not budge, she repeated herself even more firmly. They did move aside then, slowly, as much as the narrow alley would allow, yet though neither said a word, there was an air of muttering about them. Galad came by smoothly, seeming to forget the Shinarans. She suspected that believing so would be a mistake. The top-knotted men plainly did not. Aside from one of the Forsaken, she could not imagine a man she would less like to see right then, but with that face in front of her, she was all too conscious of her own breathing, her own heartbeat. It was ludicrous. Why could the man not be ugly, or at least plain? "You knew I knew that you were following." Accusation rang strongly in her voice, though she was not sure what she was accusing him of. Not doing what she had expected and wanted, she imagined ruefully. "I assumed as much as soon as I recognized you, Nynaeve. I remember that you generally see more than you let on." She would not let him divert her with compliments. Look where that had gotten her with Valen Luca. "What are you doing in Gildan? I thought you were on your way to Altara." For a moment he stared down at her with those dark, beautiful eyes, then abruptly laughed. "In all the world, Nynaeve, only you would ask me the question I should be asking you. Very well, I'll answer you, for all it should be the other way round. I did have orders for Salidar, in Altara, but all changed when this prophet fellow—" "What is the matter? Are you unwell?" Nynaeve forced her face to smoothness. "Of course not," she said irritably. "My health is quite good, thank you very kindly." Salidar! Of course! The name was like one of Aludra's fire sticks going off in her head. All of that racking of her brain, and Galad casually handed her what she had been unable to dig up on her own. Now if only Massima found a ship quickly. If only she could make sure Galad would not betray them, without letting Uno and Regan kill him, of course. Whatever Elaine said, Nynaeve could not believe she would appreciate having her brother cut down. Small chance he would believe Elaine was not with her. "I just cannot get over my shock at seeing you." A small patch on mine, when I learned you had slipped out of Sienda. Sternness became that handsome face to an unfortunate degree, but his tone offset it, somewhat. He could have been lecturing a small girl who had sneaked out of the house after her bedtime to climb trees. "I was sick near to death with worry. What under the light possessed you? Have you any idea of the risks you ran? And to come here, of all places. Elaine always chooses to saddle a horse at the gallop if she can. But I thought that you, at least, had more sense. This so-called prophet—" He cut off, eyeing the other two men. Uno had grounded his sword point, scarred hands folded atop the pommel. Rhaegon appeared to be inspecting his blade's edge to the exclusion of everything else. "I have heard rumors," Galad went on slowly, "that he is Shinaran. You cannot have been witless enough to get yourself mixed up with him." There was too much question in that for her taste by far. "Neither of them is the prophet, Galad," she said wryly. "I've known them both for some little time, and I can assure you of that. Uno, Rhaegon, unless you intend to prune your toenails, put those things up." "Well?" They hesitated before doing as they were told, Uno grumping under his breath and glaring, but they did it finally. Men usually responded to a firm voice. Most did. Sometimes, anyway. "I hardly thought they were, Nynaeve." Galad's tone, even more arid than hers, made her bristle, but when he went on, he sounded annoyed rather than superior, and worried, which made her bristle even more, of course. He all but gave her palpitations, and he had the nerve to be worried. "I do not know what you and Elaine have fallen into here, and I do not care, so long as I can extract you from it before you are hurt. Trade is slow on the river, but a suitable boat of some sort should call in the next few days. Let me know where I can find you, and I will secure you passage to somewhere in Altara. From there you can make your way to Caemlyn." She gaped in spite of herself. "You mean to find us a ship?" "It is all I can do now." He sounded apologetic and shook his head as if arguing with himself. "I cannot escort you to safety. My duty is here." "We wouldn't want to take you from your duty," she said, a touch breathless. If he wanted to misunderstand, let him. The most she had hoped for was that he would leave them be. He seemed to feel the need to defend himself. "It is hardly safe to send you off alone, but a boat will take you away before the entire border explodes, which it will, soon or late. All it needs is one spark, and the prophet is sure to strike it if no one else does. You must see to getting yourselves to Caemlyn, you and Elaine. All I ask is your promise that you will go there. The tower is no place for either of you, or for—" He clamped his teeth shut, but he might as well have gone ahead and named Egwene. It could not hurt, having Galad looking for a boat too. If Massima could forget whether he intended to close the taverns, he could forget to have anyone find a riverboat, especially if he thought a convenient bout of forgetfulness might keep her there to further his own plans. It could not hurt, if she could trust Galad. If she could not, then she would have to hope he was not as good with that sword as he thought he was. A stark thought, but not so stark as what might happen, would happen, if he proved untrustworthy. "I am what I am, Galad, and Elaine is the same." Dodging around Massima had put a bad taste on her tongue. A little White Tower sidestepping was as close as she could come. "And you are what you are now." She raised her eyebrows significantly at his white cloak. "That lot hates the tower, and they hate women who can channel. Now that you are one of them, why shouldn't I think there will be 50 of you after me inside the hour, trying to put an arrow in my back if they can't haul me off to a cell? Me and Elaine as well." Galad's head jerked in irritation. Or maybe he was offended. "How often must I tell you? I would never let harm come to my sister, or to you." It truly was annoying, realizing that she was annoyed at the pause that made it clear she was an afterthought. She was not some silly girl to lose her wits because a man had eyes that somehow managed to be melting and incredibly penetrating at the same time. "If you say it so," she told him, and his head tossed again. "Tell me where you are put up, and I will bring word or send it as soon as I locate a suitable vessel." If Elaine was right, he could no more lie than could an Aes Sedai who had sworn the 3 oaths, but still she hesitated. A mistake here could be her last. She had a right to take risks for herself, but this risk involved Elaine too, and Tom and Julian for that matter. They were her responsibility, whatever they wanted to think. But she was here, and the decision had to be hers. Not that it might be any other way, frankly. Light woman, what more do you want of me? Galad growled, half raising his hands as though to grab her shoulders. Uno's blade was between them in a flash of bright steel, but Elaine's brother actually brushed it aside like a twig, and paid it no more mind than one. I mean no harm to you, now or ever. I swear it by my mother's name. You say that you are what you are. I know what you are, and what you are not. Perhaps half the reason I wear this, he touched an edge of his snowy cloak, is because the tower sent you out, you and Elaine and Egwene, for the light knows what reason, when you are what you are. It was like sending a boy who has just learned to hold a sword into battle, and I will never forgive them. There is still time for both of you to turn aside. You do not have to carry that sword. The tower is too dangerous for you or my sister, especially now. Half the world has become too dangerous for you. Let me help you to safety. The tightness slid from his voice, though it took on a raw edge. I beg you, Nynaeve, if anything happened to Elaine, I half wish that Egwene were with you so I could... Scrubbing a hand through his hair, he looked left and right, searching for how to convince her. Uno and Rhaegan held their blades ready to drive through his body, but he did not appear to see them. In the name of the light, Nynaeve, please allow me to do what I can. It was a simple thing that finally tipped the balance in her mind. They were in Gildan. Amadisi was the only land that actually made a crime out of a woman being able to channel, and they were on the opposite bank of the river. That left only Galad's oaths as a child of the light to battle against his duty to Elaine. She gave blood the edge in that struggle. Besides, he really was too gorgeous for her to let Uno and Rhaegan kill him. Not that that had anything to do with her decision, of course. We are with Valan Luca's show, she said at last. He blinked at her, frowned. Valan Luca's... You mean one of the menageries? Incredulity and disgust fought in his voice. What under the light are you doing in company like that? Those who keep such shows are no better than... No matter. If you need coin, I can supply some. Enough to see you in a decent inn. His tone bespoke his certainty that she would do as he wanted. Not a, can I help you with a few crowns, or a, would you like me to find a room for you? He thought they should be in an inn, so into an inn they would go. The man might have observed enough to know she would duck into an alley, but he did not know her at all, it seemed. Besides, there were reasons to stay with Luca. Do you think there is a room or a hayloft not taken in Samara? She asked, a touch more tartly than intended. I'm certain I can find... She cut him off. The last place anyone would look for us is among the shows. The last place anyone but Mogadin would look, at least. You will agree we should keep from sight as much as possible? If you did find a room, more than likely you'd have to have someone put out of it. A child of the light securing a room, so, for 2 women? That would set tongues wagging and draw eyes like flies to a mitten. He did not like it, grimacing and glaring at Uno and Rhaegan as if it were their fault, but he had enough sense to see sense. It is no fit place for either of you, but it is probably safer than anywhere inside the city at that. Since you have at least agreed to go to Caemlyn, I will say no more on it. She kept her face smooth and let him think as he wished. If he thought she had promised what she had not, that was his affair. She had managed to keep him away from the show as much as possible, though. One glimpse of his sister in those spangled white breeches, and the uproar would overshadow any riot Massima could raise. You will have to stay clear of the menagerie, mind, until you find a ship anyway. Then come to the performers' wagons at nightfall and ask for Nana. He liked that even less, if possible, but she forestalled him firmly. I've not seen a single child of the light near any of the shows. If you visit one, don't you think people will notice and ask why? His smile was still gorgeous, but it showed too many teeth. You have an answer for everything, it seems. Do you have any objection to my escorting you back there, at least? I most certainly do. There will be rumors as it is. 100 people must have noticed us talking here. She could no longer see the street past the 3 men. Yet she had no doubt passers-by were still glancing into the alley, and Uno and Regan had not resheathed their swords. "But if you accompany me, we'll be seen by 10 times as many." His wince was half rueful, half mirthful. "An answer for everything," he muttered. "But you have the right of it." Clearly he wished she did not. "Hear me, Shinarans," he said, turning his head, and suddenly his voice was steel. "I am Galadriddid Domadrid, and this woman is under my protection. As for her companion, I would count it small loss to die in order to save her the smallest harm. If you allow either to come to that smallest harm, I will find you both and kill you." Ignoring the sudden dangerous blankness of their faces as completely as he did their swords, he swung his eyes back to her.
Back, everyone.
"I suppose you still will not tell me where Egwene is." "All you need know is that she is far from here." Folding her arms beneath her breasts, she could feel her heart beating through her ribs. Was she making a dangerous mistake because of a pretty face? "And safer than any action of yours can make her." He looked as if he did not believe her, but he made no more of it. "With luck, I will find a vessel in a day or two. Until then, stay close to this Valen Luca's show. Stay low and avoid notice, as much as you can with your hair that color. And tell Elaine not to run away from me again. The light shone on you to let me find you still in one piece, and it will have to shine twice as brightly to keep you from harm if you try herring off across Gildan. This prophet's blasphemous ruffians are everywhere, without respect for law or persons, and that does not count brigands taking advantage of disorder. Samara itself is a wasp nest, but if you will sit quietly and convince my headstrong sister to do the same, I will find a way to get you out of it before you are stung." It was an effort to keep her mouth shut. Taking what she told him and making it an injunction to her? Next thing, the man would want to pack her and Elaine in wool and sit them on a shelf. "Wouldn't it be best if someone did?" a tiny voice asked. "Haven't you caused enough trouble going your own way?" She told the voice to be quiet. It did not listen, but began listing disasters and near disasters sprung from her own stubbornness. Apparently taking her silence for acquiescence, he turned away from her and stopped. Regan and Uno had moved to block his way to the street, glancing at her with that strange, deceptive calm men so often adopted when they were a hair's breadth from sudden violence. The air seemed to crackle until she motioned hurriedly. The Shinarans lowered their blades and stood aside, and Galad took his hands from his sword, brushed past them, and melded into the crowd without a backward glance. Nynaeve gave Uno and Regan each a good glare before stalking off in the opposite direction. There she had had everything arranged properly, and they had to nearly ruin it all. Men always seemed to think violence could solve anything. If she had had a stout stick, she would have thumped all 3 of them about the shoulders until they saw reason. The Shinarans seemed to see a little of it now. They caught up to her, swords scabbarded on their backs once more, and followed without a word, even when she twice took a wrong turn and had to double back. It was especially well for them that they kept silent then. She had had enough of holding her tongue. First Massima, and then Galad. All she wanted was a wafer-thin excuse to tell someone exactly what she thought. Especially that little voice in her head, pushed back to an insect buzz now, but refusing to be quiet. By the time they were out of Samara and on that dirt cart track with its sparse traffic, the voice refused to be denied. She worried over Ram's arrogance, but hers had brought herself and others as near calamity as made no never mind. For Birgitta, perhaps it was well over the line, even if she was alive. The best thing was for Nynaeve not to confront them again, not the Black Aja and not Mogadine, not until someone who knew what they were doing could decide what should be done. Protest welled up, but she stamped on it as firmly as she ever had on Tom or Julian. She would go to Salidar and hand the matter over to the Blues. That was how it would be. She was set on it. "Have you eaten something that disagrees with you?" Regan said. "Your mouth is twisted as if you had chewed a ripe duckberry." She gave him a look that snapped his teeth shut and stalked on. The 2 Shinarans kept pace to either side. What was she going to do with them? That she should put them to some use was never in doubt. Their appearance was too providential to throw away. For one thing, 2 additional pairs of eyes, well, 3 eyes anyway. She was going to learn to look at that patch without swallowing if it killed her. More eyes hunting for a ship might mean finding one sooner. All very well if Massima or Galad found the vessel first, but she did not want either to know more of her doings than she had to allow. There was no telling what either might do. "Are you following me because Massima told you to look after me?" she demanded. "Or because Galad did?" "What flaming difference does it make?" Uno muttered. "If the Lord Dragon has summoned you, you bloody well—" He cut off, frowning, as she raised one finger. Rhaegan eyed it as if it were a weapon. "Do you mean to help Elaine and me reach Rand?" "We've nothing better to do," Rhaegan said dryly. "As it is, we'll not see Shinar again until we are gray and toothless. We might as well ride with you to Tyr or wherever he is." She had not considered that, but it made sense. 2 more to help Tom and Julian with chores and standing guard. No need to let them know how long that might take, or how many stops and detours could lie along the way. The Blues in Salidar might not let any of them go further. Once they reached Aes Sedai, they would be only accepted again. Stop thinking about it. You are going to do it. The crowd waiting in front of Luca's garish sign appeared no smaller than it had before. A stream of people trickled into the meadow to join the throng as another stream meandered out, exclaiming over what they had seen. Now and again the boar horses were visible, rearing above the canvas wall, to oohs and ahs from those waiting to get in. Sarandon was putting them through their paces again. The Shanchan woman always saw that the Sredit got plenty of rest. She was very firm about that, whatever Luca wanted. Men did do as they were told when you left no doubt that anything else was inconceivable. Usually they did. Short of the well-trampled brown grass, Nynaeve stopped and turned to face the 2 Shinarans. She kept her face calm, but they looked suitably wary, though in Uno's case, regrettably, that involved fiddling with his eye patch in a queasy-making way. The folk heading to or from the show paid no heed to them. "Then it will not be because of Massima or Galad," she said firmly. "If you are going to travel with me, you will do as I say. Else you can go your own way, for I'll have none of you." Of course they had to exchange glances before nodding acceptance. "If that's how it flaming has to be," Uno growled, "then well enough. If you don't have somebody to bloody well look after you, you'll never flaming live to reach the Lord Dragon. Some sheep-gutted farmer will have you for breakfast because of your tongue." Rhaegan gave him a guarded look that said he agreed with every word, but strongly doubted Uno's wisdom in voicing them. Rhaegan, it seemed, had the makings of a wise man in him. If they accepted her terms, it did not really matter why. For now, there would be plenty of time later to set them straight. "I don't doubt the others will agree too," Rhaegan said. "Others?" she said, blinking. "You mean there are more than the 2 of you? How many?" "There are only 15 of us altogether now. I don't think Bartu or Nengar will come." Sniffing after the bloody prophet. Uno turned his head and spat copiously. "Only 15. Sar went over that bloody cliff in the mountains, and Mendao had to get himself into a flaming duel with 3 hunters for the horn, and—" Nynaeve was too busy stopping herself from gaping to listen. 15! She could not help toting up in her head what it would cost to feed 15 men. Even when they were not particularly hungry, Tom or Jewel in either one ate more than Elaine and her combined. Light. On the other hand, with 15 Shinaran soldiers, there was no need to wait for a ship. A riverboat was certainly the fastest way to travel. She remembered what she had heard of Salidar now. A river town, or close by. A boat could take them right to it. Yet a Shinaran escort would make their wagon just as safe, from white cloaks or bandits or followers of the Prophet, but much slower. And a lone wagon heading away from Samara with such an escort would certainly stand out. A signpost for Mogadin or the Black Aja. I will let the Blues deal with them, and that is that. "What is wrong?" Rhaegan asked, and Uno added apologetically, "I shouldn't have mentioned how Sakaru died." Sakaru? That must have been after she stopped listening. I don't spend much time around ladies. I forget you have delicate stomachs. If he did not stop tugging at that eye patch, he was going to find out how delicate her stomach was. The number changed nothing. If 2 Shinarans were good, 15 were wonderful. Her own private army. No need to worry about white cloaks or brigands or riots, or whether she had made a mistake about Galad. How many hams could 15 men eat every day? A firm voice. Right then. Every night just after dark, one of you, will come here and ask for Nana. That's the name I am known by. She had no reason for the order except to put them in the habit of doing what she told them. Elaine goes by Morellin, but you ask for Nana. If you need coin, come to me, not Massima. She had to suppress a wince as the words left her mouth. There was still gold in the wagon's stove, but Luca had not demanded his 100 gold crowns yet, and he would. There was always the jewelry if need be, though. She had to be sure they were weaned away from Massima. Aside from that, none of you are to come near me or the show. Without that, they would likely set a guard or some such idiocy. Not unless a riverboat arrives. In that case, you come running on the instant. Do you understand me? No, Uno muttered. Why do we flaming have to keep away? His head jerked back, as her admonitory finger almost touched his nose. Do you remember what I said about your language? She had to make herself give him a level look. That glaring red eye patch made her stomach do flips. Unless you do remember, you will learn why men in the 2 rivers have decent tongues in their mouths. She watched him turn that over in his mind. He did not know what her connection with the White Tower was, only that it existed. She might be an agent of the Tower, or Tower-trained, or even Aes Sedai, though one not long to the shawl. And the threat was vague enough for him to put his own worst interpretation to it. She had known that technique long before hearing Julian mention it to Elaine. When it appeared the idea had taken hold, and before he could ask any questions, she lowered her hand. You will stay away for the same reason Galad does, so as not to draw attention. For the rest, you will do it because I say so. If I must explain my every decision to you, I'll have time for nothing else, so you must make the best of it. That was a suit of the Aes Sedai comment. Besides, they had no choice if they intended to help her reach Rand, as they thought, which meant they had no choice. All in all, she was feeling quite satisfied with herself as she shooed them off back toward Samara and strode past the waiting crowd and under the sign bearing Valan Luca's name. To her surprise, there was an addition to the show. On a new platform not far from the entry, a woman in gauzy yellow trousers was standing on her head, arms outstretched to either side with a pair of white doves on each hand. No, not on her head. The woman was gripping some sort of wooden frame in her teeth and balancing on that. As Nynaeve watched, aghast, the peculiar acrobat lowered her hands to the platform for a moment while bending herself double until she seemed to be sitting on her own head. Even that was not enough. Her legs curved down in front of her, then impossibly back up under her arms, whereupon she transferred the doves to the upturned soles of her feet, now the highest part of the contorted ball she had knotted herself into. The onlookers gasped and applauded, but the sight made Nynaeve shiver. It was all too good a reminder of what Mogadine had done to her. That isn't why I mean to hand her over to the Blues, she told herself. I just do not want to cause calamity again. That was true, but she was also afraid that the next time she would not escape so easily or so lightly. She would not have admitted that to another soul. She did not like admitting it to herself. Giving the contortionist one last puzzled glance, she could not begin to puzzle out what the woman had twisted herself into now. She turned away, and started as Elaine and Brigitta suddenly appeared at her side out of the milling crowd. Elaine had a cloak decently covering her white coat and breeches. Brigitta was all but flaunting her low-necked red gown. No, there was no all but to it. She stood even straighter than usual, and had tossed back her braid to remove even its minimal covering. Nynaeve fingered the knot of her shawl at her waist. wishing every glance at Brigitta did not remind her how much she herself would be showing once the gray wool came off. The other woman's quiver hung at her belt, and she carried the bow Luca had found for her. Surely the day was too late for her to go through with the shooting. A glance at the sky told Nynaeve she was wrong. Despite everything that had happened, the sun still stood well above the horizon. Shadows stretched long, but not long enough to dissuade Brigitta, she suspected. In an attempt to cover checking the sun, she nodded toward the woman in the gauzy trousers, who had now begun to twist herself into something that Nynaeve knew was impossible, while still balancing on her teeth. Where did she come from? Luca hired her, Brigitta answered calmly. He bought some leopards as well. Her name is Moellen. If Brigitta was all self-possessed coolness, Elaine very nearly quivered with emotion. Where did she come from? She spluttered. She came from a show that a mob nearly destroyed. I heard about that, Nynaeve said. But that isn't what's important. Not important? Elaine rolled her eyes to the heavens as if for guidance. Did you also hear why? I don't know whether it was White Cloaks or this prophet, but somebody whipped up that mob because they thought... She glanced around without slowing and lowered her voice. None of the crowd had stopped, but every passer-by stared at two obvious performers standing. That a woman in the show might wear a shawl. She emphasized the last word significantly. Fools to think she'd be with a traveling menagerie, but then you and I are, and you go dashing into the city without a word to anyone. We've heard everything from a bald-headed man carrying you off over his shoulder to you kissing a Shinaran and traipsing away with him arm in arm. Nynaeve was still gaping when Brigitta added, Luca was upset, whatever the tale. He said... She cleared her throat and made her voice deep. So she likes rough men, does she? Well, I can be as rough as a winter cob. And off he set, leaving two lads with shoulders like Skandin quarrymen to fetch you back. Tom Marilyn and Julian Sandar went as well, in not much better temper. That did not improve Luca's, but they were all so upset over you it left no room for anger at each other. For a moment, Nynaeve stared in confusion. She liked rough men? What could he possibly mean by... Slowly it sank in, and she groaned. Oh, that is just what I need. And Tom and Julian running around Samara, the like knew what trouble they could get into. I still want to know what you thought you were doing, Elaine said, but we are wasting time here. Nynaeve let them start her off through the crowd, one to either side, but even with the news of Luca and the others, she felt satisfied with her day's work. We should be out of here in a day or two, with luck. If Galad doesn't find us a boat, Massima will. It turns out he is the prophet. You remember Massima, Elaine? That sour-faced Shinaran we saw... Realizing that Elaine had stopped, Nynaeve paused for her to catch up again. Galad? The younger woman said disbelievingly, forgetting to hold her cloak closed. You spoke to Galad? And the prophet? You must have. Or how would they be trying to find a vessel? Did you have tea with them? Or did you just meet them in a common room, where the bald-headed man carried you, no doubt? Maybe the king of Gildan was there too. Would you please convince me I am dreaming so I can wake up? Get a grip on yourself, Nynaeve said firmly. It is a queen now, not a king, and yes, she was. And he wasn't bald, he had a topknot. The Shinaran, I mean, not the prophet. He's as bald as... She glared at Brigitta until the woman stopped snickering. The glower slipped a little when Nynaeve remembered who she was glowering at and what she had done to her, but if the woman had not smoothed her features...
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. Excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.